across the shallow expanse of Lake Erie, where the least depth among the Great Lakes meets some of the most volatile weather patterns in the region. Records of maritime travel repeatedly point to a place where conditions can shift with little warning. Storm-driven waves, sudden wind changes, and rapidly forming squalls have shaped a long history of wrecks and losses across waters that appear deceptively manageable compared to deeper inland seas, yet have consistently produced outcomes that defy expectation. This is where the title takes form in reality rather than description. You're about to trace the tragedies of Lake Erie through documented disasters, modern incidents, and environmental behaviour that explains why its shallow depth does not reduce danger, but often intensifies it. Revealing a pattern where familiarity, forecasting, and experience still collide with a lake that continues to take lives across generations. The Great Lake that should have been the safest. On a calm summer morning, Lake Erie can appear almost deceptively ordinary. Its waters stretch across the border between the United States and Canada, reflecting the sky in long bands of blue that seem no different from countless other lakes scattered across North America. From the shore, there is little to suggest that this body of water has inspired generations of sailors, fishermen, divers, and historians to speak about it with a mixture of respect and unease. Yet beneath that tranquil surface lies a history so crowded with loss that even now, centuries after the first commercial vessels began crossing these waters, many questions remain unanswered. The Great Lakes are often compared to inland seas, and Lake Erie is the smallest by volume except for Lake Ontario. More importantly, it is the shallowest of all 5 Great Lakes, with an average depth of only about 62 feet and a maximum depth of roughly 210 feet. At first glance, that statistic seems reassuring rather than alarming. Deep water has long been associated with danger, whether in oceans, trenches, or vast northern lakes. By comparison, a shallower lake might seem easier to navigate, easier to survive, and less capable of producing the kinds of disasters normally associated with open seas. Logic suggests that Lake Superior, with its immense depths and remote stretches of water, should be the greater threat. History tells a very different story. For centuries, Lake Erie served as one of the most important transportation corridors in North America. Indigenous peoples travelled its shores long before Europeans arrived, using the lake as part of extensive trade and communication networks. During the 18th and 19th centuries, as settlements expanded and commerce increased, Lake Erie became a crucial link between the eastern United States and the rapidly developing interior of the continent. Cargo vessels, passenger steamers, schooners, fishing boats, and later massive freighters crossed its waters in enormous numbers. Prosperity flowed across the lake, but so did tragedy. The scale of that tragedy is difficult to comprehend. Historians and maritime researchers estimate that more than 2,000 shipwrecks, and possibly more than 2,500, lie on the bottom of Lake Erie. The exact number remains uncertain because many vessels vanished without leaving enough evidence to identify their final resting places. Some were swallowed during violent storms, others disappeared during fog, collisions, fires, or unexplained accidents. While hundreds of wrecks have been located and documented, many remain undiscovered, scattered across the lakebed in darkness and silence. Their crews, cargoes, and final moments are known only through fragments of historical records. What makes that number remarkable is not merely its size, but its concentration. Lake Erie contains one of the highest densities of shipwrecks anywhere in the Great Lakes system. Divers exploring the lake have discovered remarkably preserved wooden vessels resting upright on the bottom, protected by cold freshwater that slows the destructive processes common in saltwater environments. Some wrecks appear almost frozen in time, their hulls still recognizable decades or even centuries after they sank. Anchors remain in place, cargo rests where it settled. In certain cases, ship bells, tools, and personal belongings remain scattered across decks that no living sailor has walked upon for generations. These discoveries have transformed parts of Lake Erie into what many historians describe as an underwater museum. Yet unlike a museum, much of the collection remains hidden. Each newly discovered wreck raises fresh questions. Why did the vessel sink? What happened during its final hours? Were survivors ever found? In some cases, researchers possess only a name and a rough location. In others, even the identity of the vessel remains uncertain. The lake guards its secrets carefully. That mystery has helped shape Lake Erie's reputation. Across generations, sailors developed a healthy respect for the lake that often bordered on fear. Reports from the 19th century frequently described conditions changing with startling speed. A voyage that began beneath clear skies could become a struggle for survival before the day ended. Captains who spent decades navigating the Great Lakes repeatedly warned that Lake Erie possessed a temperament unlike any of its neighbours. The danger was not always visible at the start. That was part of what made it so unsettling. Stories of disasters spread from port to port. Families waited for ships that never arrived. Newspapers filled with accounts of vessels lost during storms and rescue attempts that ended in failure. Entire communities along the shoreline became connected through these tragedies. Shipwrecks were not isolated events affecting distant strangers. They were local catastrophes that claimed fathers, sons, brothers, and friends whose livelihoods depended upon the water. As the years passed, a strange contradiction emerged. The lake that appeared least threatening on a map repeatedly produced some of the most devastating maritime disasters in the region. Larger lakes certainly claimed ships and lives, but Lake Erie seemed to do so with unusual frequency. Its reputation became so deeply rooted that experienced mariners often approached it with caution regardless of the season. Many understood that the danger could not be measured simply by depth or size. The contradiction becomes even more striking when viewed from a modern perspective. Today, weather satellites monitor storms across North America. Radar systems track developing conditions in real time. Ships are constructed from steel, equipped with advanced navigation technology, and connected through communication systems unimaginable to 19th century sailors. Yet accidents still occur. Search and rescue operations continue. Recreational boaters and commercial crews alike remain vulnerable to conditions that can develop with surprising speed. Despite every technological advantage, Lake Erie has never entirely surrendered its reputation. This raises a question that has puzzled observers for generations. How did the shallowest Great Lake become one of the deadliest? Why did thousands of vessels meet their end in waters that, on paper, should have posed less danger than the vast depths of Superior, Michigan or Huron? The answer is not hidden within a single disaster or one tragic storm. It lies in the very nature of the lake itself, in characteristics so ordinary that they seem harmless, until they combine in precisely the wrong way. And it begins with the feature that should have made Lake Erie the safest of them all, when shallow water becomes a weapon. To understand the true source of Lake Erie's danger, it is necessary to look beyond the wrecks and examine the landscape that made so many of them possible. The ships resting on the lake bed were not all victims of extraordinary storms, navigational blunders, or mechanical failures. Many were caught by forces that existed long before a vessel ever entered the water, woven into the shape and structure of the lake itself. For generations, sailors recognized the consequences without fully understanding the mechanism behind them. They knew certain stretches of Lake Erie could become terrifying with little warning, and they knew that a body of water which appeared modest on a map often behaved with a violence that seemed wildly disproportionate to its size. Contrary to what intuition might suggest, the feature that separates Erie from the other Great Lakes is not its size, but its lack of depth. While Lake Superior reaches depths exceeding 1,300 feet, and Lake Michigan plunges beyond 900 feet, Lake Erie averages only about 62 feet deep. Even its deepest point measures roughly 210 feet. To an observer standing on shore, that might sound reassuring. Deep water has always carried an aura of danger, while shallower water feels more approachable, more predictable, and somehow less threatening. Yet Lake Erie's unusual reputation exists largely because that assumption turns out to be wrong. The lake's shallowness is not a limitation on its power. In many ways, it is the source of that power. Hidden beneath every storm that sweeps across the lake is a simple, physical reality that has shaped centuries of maritime disasters. Wind transfers energy into water, creating waves that travel across the surface. In deeper bodies of water, a portion of that energy can extend farther downward through the water column, helping waves develop into longer, more rolling patterns. Lake Erie does not offer the same opportunity. Its relatively shallow basin restricts how that energy behaves. Instead of dispersing through great depths, much of the force remains concentrated near the surface, where it can produce steeper and more chaotic conditions. What appears to be a minor geographic detail begins to influence everything that happens above it. Stretching across the heart of the Great Lakes region, Eerie possesses a shape that allows wind to gather strength over extraordinary distances. The lake extends for roughly 241 miles from west to east, while remaining comparatively narrow. This creates what meteorologists call a fetch, the uninterrupted distance across open water over which wind can build momentum. The concept sounds simple, but its consequences can be profound. When strong winds move across a long fetch, they continuously transfer energy into the water beneath them. Every mile adds to the process. Every additional hour of sustained wind increases the amount of force being stored within the lake. By the time those winds reach the far end of Eerie, the water below has often been transformed into something far more dangerous than conditions at the point where the storm first began. What developed from this unusual combination of shallow water and uninterrupted wind was something many sailors considered far more dangerous than ordinary waves. Ocean waves are often imagined as smooth, rolling swells that rise and fall in a predictable rhythm. Lake Erie can produce something very different. Under certain conditions, waves become shorter, steeper, and far more abrupt. Sailors have often referred to these as square waves, a term used to describe waves whose shape appears unusually vertical compared to the longer profiles found in deeper waters. Rather than lifting a vessel gently upward before lowering it into the next trough, these waves can strike with startling force, slamming into hulls from angles that place enormous stress on both ships and crews. Accounts from Great Lakes mariners frequently describe these conditions with an intensity usually reserved for ocean storms. The danger was not always found in the height of the waves alone. A wave measuring 10 feet on Lake Erie could prove far more hazardous than a larger swell elsewhere because of the speed and steepness with which it developed. The lake seemed capable of replacing rhythm with chaos. Instead of moving with the water, vessels found themselves colliding with it. Crews attempting to maintain course could face repeated impacts that arrived before the ship had fully recovered from the previous one. Far beyond the shoreline, another threat emerged from the pace at which those waves arrived. Wave period, the time between successive wave crests, plays a crucial role in determining how vessels respond to rough water. On the open ocean, waves often arrive with relatively long intervals between them, allowing ships time to rise, settle, and redistribute stress. Lake Erie frequently produces much shorter wave periods. In severe conditions, waves can arrive only a few seconds apart. To those aboard a vessel, the difference is dramatic. Instead of a sequence of separate impacts, the experience becomes a relentless series of blows with almost no opportunity for recovery. This rapid rhythm transformed rough weather into something far more exhausting and destructive. Water swept across decks with greater frequency. Steering became increasingly difficult. Crew members found themselves constantly bracing against motion that never seemed to stop. More importantly, the ships themselves endured continuous structural strain. Every rise and fall imposed new forces on hulls already struggling against wind, cargo weight, and heavy seas. The lake's violence was not expressed through a single overwhelming impact. It emerged through repetition. For crews serving aboard long cargo vessels, the violence of the lake was often measured not by height, but by rhythm. As commercial shipping expanded during the 19th and 20th centuries, increasingly large freighters began transporting coal, iron ore, grain, and other commodities across the Great Lakes. These ships could stretch hundreds of feet in length. Under normal conditions, their size was an advantage. During severe weather on Lake Erie, it could become a vulnerability. When a long vessel encounters short-period waves, different sections of the ship may occupy entirely different positions relative to the water at the same moment. The bow and stern can rest on wave crests, while the centre hangs above a trough. Moments later, the situation reverses, with the middle supported while the ends dip downward. Naval architects refer to these opposing stresses as hogging and sagging. The terminology sounds technical, but the consequences are deeply physical. Each cycle forces the ship to bend slightly. One cycle alone is not a problem. Hundreds or thousands of cycles during a storm create a very different situation. Unlike disasters caused by fire, collision, or navigational mistakes, this process often began invisibly within the structure of the ship itself. Steel possesses immense strength, yet it is not immune to fatigue. Repeated stress gradually weakens materials over time. Tiny imperfections expand. Connections endure increasing strain. Components designed to withstand enormous loads slowly approach their limits. To sailors aboard a vessel caught in severe conditions, The warning signs could be unsettling. Hull plates groaned, rivets shifted. The entire ship seemed to complain beneath their feet as waves continued their relentless assault. Maritime investigations have repeatedly shown that weather on the Great Lakes can contribute to structural failures in ways that are not immediately obvious to outside observers. A vessel may survive dozens of storms only to encounter one combination of wave frequency, wind direction, and structural stress that exposes an existing weakness. The final failure appears sudden, but the process leading to it may have unfolded over years. Lake Erie's conditions often accelerated that process, repeatedly testing ships in exactly the areas where they were most vulnerable. Even the most experienced captains discovered that knowledge of storms did not always prepare them for the particular behaviour of Lake Erie. Many had spent their lives at sea. They understood weather, navigation, and ship handling. Yet reports from across the lake's history reveal a recurring theme: surprise. Captains expected difficult conditions and found something worse. Crews entered storms believing they understood the risks, only to encounter waves behaving in ways they had rarely seen elsewhere. The lake repeatedly challenged assumptions, and assumptions are often the first casualties of dangerous water. Part of the mystery lies in how ordinary the setting appears before conditions deteriorate. Nothing about the lake's outline on a map suggests a natural mechanism capable of producing such consequences. Its dimensions are measurable, its depth is known. The physics governing its behaviour are understood today far better than they were centuries ago. Yet the reality remains unsettling because the danger emerges not from something extraordinary, but from familiar elements arranged in a particular way. Wind, water, distance, and depth combine into a system capable of generating far more destruction than any one of those factors could produce alone. Seen as a whole, the evidence points toward a conclusion that would have seemed almost absurd to anyone viewing the lake from shore. The feature most people would identify as a sign of safety became one of the primary reasons for its reputation. Lake Erie did not need immense depths to threaten ships. It possessed something far more effective, a geography perfectly suited to amplifying energy where sailors were forced to confront it directly. Beneath every wreck, every desperate struggle against heavy seas, and every captain's account of unexpectedly violent conditions, that reality remained constant. Then there were the days when the lake altered its character with such speed that the first warning often arrived at the same moment as the disaster itself. The lake that can change in an hour. Many of the voyages that ended in disaster began beneath skies that did not indicate what was approaching. A captain could leave port beneath scattered clouds, a crew could settle into the familiar rhythm of routine duties, and passengers could look across seemingly calm water without sensing anything unusual ahead. In countless historical accounts from Lake Erie, the most unsettling detail is not the storm itself, but the normality that preceded it. The danger often announced itself quietly, hidden within changes too subtle for most people to notice. By the time the true threat became visible, the opportunity to avoid it was frequently disappearing just as quickly. Situated at crossroads where competing weather systems frequently converge, Lake Erie occupies one of the most meteorologically active regions in the Great Lakes. Warm, moisture-rich air masses moving northward from the Gulf of Mexico regularly encounter colder air descending from Canada, creating an environment where atmospheric conditions can shift dramatically within short periods of time. The Great Lakes themselves further complicate this process. Their enormous surface areas influence local temperatures, wind patterns, and moisture levels, helping generate weather systems that can behave differently from those found farther inland. For centuries, sailors crossing Eerie found themselves operating within a region where the atmosphere was often in a state of negotiation, with competing forces struggling for control overhead. Unlike deeper bodies of water that often absorb change more gradually, Eerie reacts to shifts in the atmosphere with unusual speed. Its relatively shallow basin allows wind energy to influence surface conditions rapidly, meaning that weather changes can be reflected on the water far sooner than many mariners expect. This responsiveness has contributed significantly to the lake's reputation. On larger and deeper bodies of water, deteriorating conditions may unfold over a longer period, providing crews with more opportunities to recognize developing danger. Eerie frequently offers less time. A shift in wind direction, an increase in wind speed, or the arrival of a pressure system can begin altering conditions across large sections of the lake before vessels have an opportunity to reach shelter. Generations of mariners crossed these waters long before modern forecasting provided advance warning of developing conditions. During much of the 19th century, captains relied upon observation, experience, and local knowledge. They watched cloud formations, they studied wind behaviour, they paid attention to temperature changes and the appearance of the horizon. Every voyage involved a degree of uncertainty, but on Lake Erie that uncertainty carried particular weight. There were no weather satellites tracking storms hundreds of miles away. There were no electronic forecasts updated by the hour. Information travelled slowly, while storms often moved quickly. A captain's understanding of approaching danger was limited to whatever signs could be observed directly from the deck. Among the countless details sailors learned to observe, few inspired more attention than a falling barometer. Long before radar existed, barometric pressure provided one of the clearest warnings that atmospheric conditions were changing. Experienced mariners understood that rapidly dropping pressure often signaled the approach of severe weather. Yet even this knowledge came with limitations. A barometer could indicate that trouble was developing, but it could not reveal precisely how quickly that trouble would arrive or how severe it would become. On Lake Erie, where weather systems could intensify with alarming speed, that uncertainty sometimes proved critical. The instrument offered a warning, but not always enough time to act upon it. Historical records repeatedly describe storms that appear to gather strength far faster than expected. Conditions that seemed manageable during the morning could become dangerous by afternoon. Winds strengthened, visibility deteriorated, waves increased in both height and frequency. What made these events particularly frightening was the pace of the transformation. Sailors often expect storms to announce themselves gradually, providing a sequence of warnings that allows for preparation. Lake Erie did not always follow that script. Numerous accounts describe situations in which deteriorating weather seemed to accelerate unexpectedly, compressing the timeline between concern and crisis. Once the balance of the atmosphere began to unravel, the transformation could unfold with startling momentum. Strong winds moving across the lake's long fetch rapidly transferred energy into the water. Visibility could be reduced by rain, mist, or blowing spray. Shorelines that had seemed comfortably close could vanish behind curtains of weather. Navigation became more difficult precisely as conditions demanded greater precision. Every decision carried additional consequences. Should a vessel continue toward its destination or attempt to reach shelter? Was the nearest harbour still accessible? Would conditions worsen or stabilise? Such questions often had to be answered with incomplete information while the lake changed around them. Few events demonstrated this reality more clearly than the storm that swept across the Great Lakes on October 20th, 1916, a day remembered in maritime history as Black Friday. Although the chapter ahead will examine the consequences of major disasters in greater detail, the weather itself deserves attention here because it illustrated the lake's capacity for rapid transformation. Meteorological conditions combined in a manner that produced exceptionally dangerous weather across Lake Erie. Winds intensified dramatically, waves built quickly, and multiple vessels found themselves caught in conditions that had become far more severe than many expected. For sailors observing the lake that morning, the difference between relative calm and extreme danger unfolded over a remarkably short span of time. Accounts preserved in logbooks, newspapers, and maritime records reveal a pattern that appeared again and again throughout the lake's history. The details varied from one voyage to another, but the sequence often felt familiar. A routine crossing began under manageable conditions. Signs of change appeared gradually at first. The atmosphere grew unsettled, wind increased, visibility worsened, then the pace accelerated. What had seemed like an ordinary weather event developed into something much more serious. Again and again, the speed of the transition became one of the defining characteristics of the disaster. This pattern contributed significantly to the psychological reputation of Lake Erie among sailors. Mariners can prepare for known dangers. They can respect storms visible on the horizon. They can avoid conditions they recognize in advance. Sudden change is more difficult to confront because it compresses the time available for decision-making. Every minute lost can become important. Every delayed response carries greater risk. In this sense, the lake's unpredictability became as feared as its storms. It was not simply the possibility of bad weather that troubled sailors. but the possibility that bad weather could arrive before preparations were complete. More troubling than the severity of many storms was the fact that crews often had very little time to respond. Even experienced captains who understood Lake Erie well could find themselves struggling against circumstances that evolved faster than expected. Harbours that appeared reachable became distant, safe routes became dangerous. Conditions that seemed temporary intensified instead of improving. The lake's history contains numerous examples of vessels overtaken, not because their crews ignored danger, but because danger developed faster than anyone anticipated. When calm conditions eventually returned, the surface frequently concealed all evidence of the turmoil that had existed only hours earlier. Waves subsided, winds weakened, the horizon cleared. To observers arriving afterward, it could be difficult to imagine what had occurred. The same water that had seemed hostile and uncontrollable resumed its familiar appearance, reflecting sunlight and stretching peacefully toward distant shores. Yet beneath that calm surface lingered the consequences of every storm that had arrived too quickly, every warning that came too late, and every voyage interrupted before it could be completed. Far below those seemingly peaceful waters rested the accumulating record of every ship that had failed to escape in time. Graveyard of the inland seas, hidden beneath the routes once travelled by countless sailors, lies a landscape few people ever witness. To most observers, Lake Erie is defined by its surface, a horizon of open water stretching between distant shores, ferries crossing established routes, fishing boats moving across familiar waters, and weather systems passing overhead. Yet far below that visible world rests another landscape entirely, one built not by nature alone, but by centuries of human activity and misfortune. It is a place where stories ended abruptly, where voyages vanished from schedules and newspapers, and where the physical evidence of those events settled into silence. For generations, the lake concealed this hidden record so completely that many people remained unaware of its scale. Far below the changing surface, the lake reveals a world shaped by silence rather than weather. Sunlight gradually disappears with depth, leaving much of the lake bed in dim conditions where familiar landmarks cease to exist. The environment is cold, still, and remarkably undisturbed compared to many marine settings. Waves that pound the surface during storms rarely affect the deeper sections where wrecks eventually come to rest. Time moves differently there. Objects lost decades earlier can remain in place. Structures abandoned by disaster may survive far longer than intuition suggests. The result is a submerged landscape that often appears less like a scene of destruction and more like a collection of frozen moments. Estimates compiled by historians and maritime researchers point toward a staggering reality. More than 2,000 shipwrecks are believed to rest somewhere within Lake Erie, and some estimates place the number significantly higher. Determining the exact total is nearly impossible, because records from earlier centuries are often incomplete. Some vessels disappeared during storms without witnesses. Others were reported lost, but their final locations were never identified. In certain cases, entire ships simply vanished from the historical record after departing port. The uncertainty surrounding the total number of wrecks only adds to the mystery. Even after generations of research, no one can say with complete confidence how many vessels remain hidden beneath the lake. What makes that figure particularly remarkable is the relatively small size of Lake Erie compared to some of its neighbouring Great Lakes. The lake contains an extraordinary concentration of wrecks within a comparatively confined area. Historians often describe it as one of the most densely packed shipwreck regions in North America. The dangers explored in previous chapters, sudden weather changes, short steep waves, and rapidly developing storms, help explain part of that concentration. Yet those factors alone cannot account for the sheer volume of losses. Another important piece of the story lies in the role Lake Erie played in the economic development of an entire continent. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, traffic across the lake expanded dramatically. Settlements along the Great Lakes grew into major cities. Industries demanded enormous quantities of raw materials. Agricultural products moved toward expanding markets. Passenger travel connected communities separated by water. Lake Erie became one of the most important transportation corridors in North America, carrying cargoes of grain, coal, lumber, iron ore, and countless other commodities. Ships crossed the lake in every season that conditions allowed. Harbours remained busy. New vessels entered service. Every increase in traffic created new opportunities for commerce, but it also increased exposure to danger. The more ships entered the lake, the more opportunities existed for disaster. This relationship between commerce and risk can be observed throughout maritime history. Busy waterways often accumulate accidents simply because they experience more traffic. Lake Erie followed that pattern on a remarkable scale. Steamships shared routes with schooners. Cargo vessels crossed paths with passenger ships. Fishing fleets operated alongside commercial traffic. Navigation improved over time, yet the volume of activity remained immense. Even in years without major catastrophes, smaller losses continued to occur. Some ships grounded during storms, others collided. Mechanical failures stranded vessels in dangerous conditions. Collectively, these incidents contributed to the growing accumulation on the lakebed. Unlike many ocean wrecks that deteriorate rapidly after sinking, vessels lost in Eerie often remain remarkably intact. One of the reasons lies in the nature of freshwater itself. Saltwater environments contain organisms such as shipworms that consume wood and accelerate the destruction of submerged structures. The Great Lakes lack these organisms, allowing wooden wrecks to survive far longer than they would in many marine environments. Combined with cold temperatures and relatively stable conditions at depth, this has created an environment capable of preserving vessels in extraordinary detail. Divers exploring certain wreck sites have reported scenes that feel almost suspended in time. Wooden hulls remain recognizable. Cargoes can still be found where they settled. Anchors, fittings, and portions of deck structures sometimes survive despite decades or even centuries underwater. The effect can be deeply unsettling. A ship that vanished from the world generations ago may still exist in recognizable form, resting where it came to its final stop. While deterioration inevitably occurs, the rate is often slow enough to preserve details that would have disappeared elsewhere long ago. Some of the most striking discoveries emerge from places where no visible sign of a ship's existence remained above water. Modern sonar technology has revealed wrecks hidden beneath sediment, while advances in diving equipment have allowed researchers to investigate sites that were once inaccessible. Each discovery contributes another piece to the broader story of Lake Erie. Sometimes a known wreck is finally located after decades of uncertainty. In other cases, an unexpected sonar image reveals a vessel that was not even known to exist in that location. The lake continues to produce surprises, reminding researchers that much of its history remains unexplored. Not every vessel resting on the lakebed has surrendered its identity. Numerous wrecks remain unidentified despite extensive efforts to study them. Historical records may describe a ship lost during a storm, yet no definitive match has been made between the written account and a particular wreck site. Other vessels are known only through fragments of evidence discovered underwater. Researchers compare construction methods, cargo remains, dimensions, and archival documents in an attempt to solve these puzzles. Some identifications take years, others remain unresolved. The result is a collection of underwater mysteries scattered across the lake floor, each representing a story that has not yet been fully reconstructed. Modern divers and underwater archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of stories long thought forgotten. Their work extends beyond simply locating wrecks. Each investigation helps illuminate broader patterns in Great Lakes history. Cargoes reveal trade networks. Construction techniques demonstrate changes in shipbuilding. Personal artifacts offer glimpses into daily life aboard vessels that disappeared long ago. In many cases, the wrecks serve as historical records preserved in ways written documents cannot match. They provide direct physical connections to the people who lived, worked, and travelled across the lake. Taken together, these discoveries reveal how Lake Erie earned a reputation unmatched elsewhere in the Great Lakes. No single disaster created that reputation. No solitary storm or famous wreck can fully explain it. Instead, the reputation emerged gradually through accumulation. Century after century, ships entered the lake carrying passengers, crews, and cargo. Some completed their voyages without incident. Others encountered the forces described in earlier chapters and never returned. Over time, those losses collected beneath the surface until the lakebed itself became a record of the risks involved in crossing these waters. The hidden landscape below Lake Erie is therefore more than an underwater archive. It is physical proof of every danger associated with the lake. The wrecks confirm that sudden weather changes were not isolated events. They confirm that steep waves could overwhelm vessels. They confirm that sailors' fears were grounded in experience rather than superstition. Together, they form one of the most extensive collections of maritime history in North America, preserved beneath water that often appears calm to those passing overhead. Long before the lake's dangers were fully understood, a series of disasters had already begun teaching sailors lessons that would be impossible to ignore. The first warnings no one could ignore. There was a time when Lake Erie had not yet acquired the reputation that would later define it. To many observers in the early 19th century, it represented opportunity rather than danger, a vast inland waterway connecting growing communities and opening routes into regions that were developing at remarkable speed. The lake was certainly respected, but it had not yet become synonymous with shipwrecks and maritime tragedy. The stories that would eventually fill newspapers, haunt port towns, and populate the lake bed had not fully unfolded. In those years, confidence often arrived more quickly than caution, and many believed that a new age of transportation was beginning to place old dangers behind them. During the opening decades of the 19th century, the Great Lakes entered a period of extraordinary transformation. Population growth accelerated throughout the region as settlements expanded and commerce increased. Roads remained slow and often unreliable, making water transportation one of the most efficient methods of moving people and cargo. Communities along Lake Erie's shores became increasingly connected through trade, while merchants looked to the lakes as vital commercial corridors. Every season brought more traffic onto the water. Vessels carried supplies, agricultural products, passengers, and manufactured goods between ports that were becoming important centres of economic activity. The future appeared promising, and the lake itself seemed central to that future. Steam power introduced a level of confidence that earlier generations of sailors could scarcely imagine. For centuries, navigation had depended heavily on wind, forcing vessels to adapt to changing conditions and often delaying journeys for days or weeks. Steamships offered something different. They represented speed, reliability, and technological progress. Their engines reduced dependence on favourable winds and created the impression that nature's influence over transportation was gradually diminishing. To many people, these vessels seemed to symbolise a new era in which innovation would overcome obstacles that had frustrated sailors for generations. This optimism extended beyond the ships themselves. Investors funded new enterprises. Ports expanded their facilities. Passengers embraced the convenience of steam travel. Newspapers frequently celebrated technological achievements and commercial growth. The Great Lakes increasingly appeared to be waterways that could be mastered through engineering, planning, and determination. Yet beneath that confidence lingered a reality that had not changed. Lake Erie remained the same body of water it had always been, shaped by the same geography, weather patterns, and hidden hazards discussed in earlier chapters. The technology crossing its surface was evolving rapidly. The lake was not. Yet the optimism surrounding this new era soon encountered an uncomfortable reality. The early decades of commercial navigation produced incidents that challenged assumptions about safety and control. Some losses could be explained through human error or poor judgment. Others resulted from storms that overwhelmed vessels despite their technological advantages. While individual accidents did not immediately transform public opinion, they gradually accumulated into a pattern that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Each disaster raised questions about whether confidence in technology had outpaced understanding of the environment in which that technology operated. Among the vessels that symbolized this age of innovation, few were more celebrated than the Walk in the Water. Launched in 1818, it became the first steamship to operate on the upper Great Lakes, serving routes that connected Buffalo with ports farther west. The vessel represented a major milestone in regional transportation. Passengers viewed it as evidence that a new era had arrived, while businesses saw opportunities for faster and more predictable movement of goods. For several years, the Walk in the Water helped demonstrate the potential of steam navigation on the lakes, becoming one of the most recognizable vessels in the region. Its career, however, would also become one of the earliest reminders that technological progress could not eliminate risk. On November 1st, 1821, while approaching Buffalo during rough weather, the vessel grounded near the shoreline. Although everyone aboard survived, the ship itself was ultimately lost. The destruction of the Walk in the Water resonated far beyond the immediate financial consequences. This was not merely another vessel disappearing from service. It was a symbol of confidence, innovation, and progress. Its loss demonstrated that even the most advanced transportation technology available at the time remained vulnerable to the conditions of the Great Lakes. News of such losses travelled quickly through communities connected by the lakes. Ports depended on reliable transportation, and maritime accidents affected far more than the crews directly involved. Merchants worried about cargoes, investors worried about financial losses. Families worried about loved ones travelling between distant settlements. Newspapers reported incidents in detail, ensuring that stories of storms, groundings, and wrecks reached audiences far beyond the immediate area. Every disaster became part of a growing collective understanding of the risks associated with Great Lakes navigation. Economic opportunity, however, proved far stronger than fear. Commercial traffic continued to expand despite the warnings. New vessels entered service. Additional routes were established. Population growth increased demand for transportation, while economic development created powerful incentives to maintain and expand shipping operations. In many respects, this response was understandable. The benefits of waterborne commerce were enormous. Entire communities depended upon it. The challenge was that growth increased exposure to danger. More ships meant more voyages, and more voyages inevitably created more opportunities for accidents. As the years passed, additional incidents reinforced the lessons that earlier disasters had already begun teaching. Individual shipwrecks varied in their circumstances, but together they painted a clearer picture of Lake Erie's character. Storms repeatedly demonstrated their ability to overwhelm vessels. Navigational challenges continued to create hazards. Weather remained unpredictable. Even as shipbuilding improved and experience accumulated, losses persisted. No single incident established the lake's reputation. Rather, it was the repetition of such events that gradually altered public perception. These early disasters performed a function that statistics alone could never accomplish. They transformed abstract risk into lived experience. Sailors who survived storms carried their stories to other ports. Captains adjusted their expectations. Ship owners reconsidered assumptions about safety. Communities learned that the lake demanded respect regardless of technological advances. The warnings were no longer theoretical. They had become visible through damaged vessels, interrupted voyages, and names added to maritime records. Gradually, a pattern emerged that became increasingly difficult for sailors and shipowners to dismiss. The same themes appeared again and again. Confidence gave way to caution. Expectations collided with reality. Innovations that seemed capable of overcoming traditional challenges often proved less effective when confronted with the unique conditions of Lake Erie. The lake was teaching lessons that could not be ignored, and each new disaster made those lessons more difficult to forget. By the middle of the 19th century, the warning signs were no longer isolated observations. Decades of experience had revealed that Lake Erie possessed dangers unlike those anticipated by many early navigators. The confidence that accompanied the first generation of steamships had been tempered by repeated reminders that nature still held considerable power over human plans. Yet even then, the most devastating chapters of the lake's history remained ahead. Then, on a September night in 1852, one voyage would transform those warnings into one of the deadliest disasters the Great Lakes had ever seen. The night the Atlantic never reached Cleveland. For those stepping aboard that evening, there was little reason to believe the journey would be remembered long after it ended. Lake Erie had already become a busy highway of commerce and travel by the early 1850s, carrying thousands of passengers between growing cities and settlements scattered across its shores. Steamships arrived and departed according to schedules that connected communities across vast distances, and for many travellers, a voyage across the lake had become a routine part of life. Yet history often conceals its most consequential moments beneath an appearance of normality, and the events that unfolded during one September crossing would become a lasting reminder of how quickly Lake Erie could transform an ordinary journey into catastrophe. Known throughout the Great Lakes as a busy passenger steamer, the Atlantic had become a familiar sight on regional routes. Built for the demands of commercial travel, the sidewheel steamer transported both passengers and freight across Lake Erie at a time when steam navigation represented the fastest and most reliable means of transportation available. Vessels like the Atlantic embodied the confidence of an era increasingly shaped by technological progress. Steam power had reduced dependence on wind, shortened travel times, and helped knit together communities separated by hundreds of miles of water. For many travellers, boarding such a vessel inspired reassurance rather than concern. By September 1852, travel across Lake Erie had become an essential part of life and commerce throughout the region. On September 20th, the Atlantic departed Buffalo carrying a large number of passengers bound for destinations farther west. Historical accounts differ on the precise number aboard, but it is generally accepted that several hundred people were travelling on the vessel. Among them were families, labourers, merchants, and immigrants moving through the rapidly developing Great Lakes region. Some were likely making journeys they had completed before. Others may have been travelling unfamiliar routes toward new opportunities. Whatever their reasons for boarding, few could have imagined that their voyage would soon become one of the deadliest passenger disasters in Great Lakes history. As the vessel continued westward, the conditions surrounding it began to shift. Weather on Lake Erie has long been capable of changing with alarming speed, and that night was no exception. Winds strengthened as darkness settled over the lake. Visibility became increasingly limited. The same characteristics that had already claimed numerous vessels throughout the lake's history once again began shaping events. Captains operating on Lake Erie understood that weather demanded constant attention, but storms did not always announce themselves clearly. Sometimes deteriorating conditions emerged gradually enough to appear manageable, until circumstances suddenly became far more dangerous. Ahead of the steamer lay one of the most challenging stretches of shoreline on the lake. Extending into Lake Erie from the northern shore of present-day Ontario, Long Point forms a narrow peninsula projecting far into the water. For generations, mariners recognized the area as a navigational hazard. The peninsula is accompanied by extensive sandbars and shallow areas that can extend well beyond the visible shoreline. In darkness or poor weather, these hazards became especially dangerous. Navigational errors that might have been survivable elsewhere could quickly become catastrophic near Long Point, where shallow water and heavy seas combined to create unforgiving conditions. Then, during the night, the voyage came to an abrupt and violent halt. Sometime during the early hours of September 21st, the Atlantic struck one of the sandbars near Long Point. The impact immediately transformed the situation aboard the vessel. Groundings were not unheard of on the Great Lakes, but under severe weather conditions they could become extraordinarily dangerous. Waves continued driving against the stranded steamer. Instead of remaining a functioning vessel capable of maneuvering through deteriorating weather, the Atlantic suddenly became trapped in an environment where wind and water could exert their full force against it. What followed unfolded in darkness, uncertainty, and rapidly worsening conditions. Historical accounts describe passengers being awakened by the shock of the grounding and the confusion that followed. The combination of darkness, rough seas, and growing panic made it difficult for many aboard to fully understand what had happened. Communication during emergencies was far more limited than it would be today. Information travelled slowly through crowded decks filled with frightened passengers attempting to assess their situation. As waves continued striking the vessel, concern began giving way to fear. The danger increased as efforts were made to move passengers away from immediate risk. Boats were launched in an attempt to carry people to safety, but the conditions made rescue operations extraordinarily difficult. Heavy surf, strong winds, and darkness created obstacles at every stage. Some boats were overturned, others struggled to navigate through the violent water surrounding the wreck. The very environment that had contributed to the disaster now complicated attempts to escape it. Survivors later described scenes of confusion as people fought to reach safety, while the storm continued around them. Attempts to organize an orderly response quickly encountered the realities of the storm. As conditions deteriorated, many passengers found themselves facing impossible choices. Remaining aboard a stranded vessel carried obvious dangers, yet entering the water or overcrowded rescue boats exposed them to equally serious risks. Historical records indicate that many lives were lost, not only during the grounding itself but during the desperate efforts to reach shore. The combination of rough water, darkness, cold conditions, and limited rescue resources created circumstances that proved overwhelming for many of those aboard. With the arrival of daylight, the full extent of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Survivors who reached shore began recounting the events of the night, while reports spread across communities connected by the Great Lakes. The casualty figures reported in contemporary sources varied, as was common following major 19th century disasters, but historians generally agree that well over 100 people lost their lives. Many estimates place the death toll at approximately 150 individuals, making the sinking of the Atlantic one of the deadliest passenger vessel disasters in Great Lakes history. The tragedy attracted widespread attention because it represented far more than the loss of a single ship. It exposed vulnerabilities that many travellers preferred not to consider. Steamships had helped create confidence in modern transportation, yet the disaster demonstrated that technology alone could not eliminate the hazards of Lake Erie. Weather, geography, and circumstance remained capable of overcoming even the most advanced vessels of the era. For communities dependent upon lake travel, the sinking served as another powerful reminder that progress and safety were not always synonymous. In the years that followed, the loss of the Atlantic remained one of the defining tragedies of Lake Erie. Maritime historians continued to study the disaster, while the wreck itself became part of the larger story preserved beneath the lake's waters. More importantly, the event reinforced a lesson that had been emerging for decades. The dangers of Lake Erie were not isolated anomalies. They were recurring realities capable of affecting anyone who crossed the lake, regardless of experience, technology, or confidence. The Atlantic did not create the lake's reputation, but it helped ensure that reputation would not be forgotten. Less than a decade later, another crowded passenger vessel would leave behind a scene of destruction that survivors struggled to describe for the rest of their lives, trapped beneath the Lady Elgin, beneath the Lady. Just 8 years after the loss of the Atlantic, another voyage began with the same assumption that the lake ahead could be crossed safely. By 1860, steamship travel had become an established part of life across the Great Lakes. Passengers boarded vessels expecting speed, convenience, and reliability, while shipping companies competed to connect the growing cities and communities scattered along the region's shores. Yet Lake Erie and the surrounding Great Lakes had already demonstrated that confidence could be fragile. The warnings described in previous years had not disappeared. They remained embedded within the waterways themselves, waiting for circumstances that would expose them once again. On a September night in 1860, those circumstances arrived with devastating consequences. Among the passenger steamers operating on the Great Lakes, few were as familiar to travellers as the Lady Elgin. Built in 1851, the sidewheel steamer was one of the most prominent passenger vessels of its era. Named after James Bruce, the 8th Earl of Elgin, the ship regularly transported travellers between ports on the Great Lakes, and had developed a reputation as a dependable vessel. At more than 250 feet in length, it was considered large and modern for its time. Thousands of passengers had crossed the lakes aboard ships like the Lady Elgin, reinforcing the belief that steam transportation was steadily overcoming the uncertainties that had challenged earlier generations of mariners. During the evening of September 7, 1860, hundreds of people settled into what appeared to be a routine journey. The vessel departed Chicago carrying a large number of passengers bound eastward. Historical accounts indicate that many aboard were members of Irish-American groups returning from political gatherings and celebrations in the city, while others were ordinary travellers making use of one of the Great Lakes' busiest transportation routes. As darkness settled over the water, most passengers likely expected little more than an uneventful overnight voyage. The weather, however, was becoming increasingly unsettled. Strong winds were moving across Lake Michigan, creating rough conditions that would complicate navigation throughout the night. Somewhere beyond the darkness, another vessel was moving through the night. The schooner Augusta was travelling on a crossing route through increasingly difficult conditions. Visibility was limited, and the powerful winds that swept across the lake created challenges for both vessels. Maritime navigation in the 19th century depended heavily upon visual observations, experience, and judgment. Long before modern radar systems existed, captains and crews relied upon lights, sound signals, and careful watchkeeping to avoid collisions. Under ideal circumstances, these methods often proved sufficient. During storms and darkness, they became far less reliable. As the hours passed, the distance separating the two vessels steadily diminished. Neither ship was alone in facing the lake's conditions. Wind, waves, and limited visibility were affecting navigation across the region. Yet history often turns on moments measured in minutes, and sometime during the early hours of September 8th, those minutes ran out. The Augusta collided with the Lady Elgin off the coast near present-day Winnetka, Illinois. The impact tore into the passenger steamer's hull with tremendous force. What had been a routine voyage only moments earlier was instantly transformed into a fight for survival. Within minutes, it became clear that the damage was far more serious than many passengers first realised. Water rushed into the vessel through the breach created by the collision. Crews worked to assess the situation while passengers attempted to understand what had happened. Some likely believed the ship could remain afloat long enough to reach safety. Others quickly recognised the severity of the emergency. The Lady Elgin had suffered catastrophic structural damage, and the rough weather surrounding the vessel left little margin for recovery. Unlike a ship grounded near shore, the steamer remained exposed to open water while the storm continued to exert pressure upon an already mortally wounded vessel. As the vessel's condition deteriorated, efforts were made to evacuate passengers and organise a response. The challenge was immense. Hundreds of people occupied the ship. Darkness obscured much of the surrounding environment. Wind and waves complicated every movement. In maritime disasters, order often depends upon time, and time was precisely what the Lady Elgin lacked. Historical accounts indicate that the ship remained afloat for only a relatively short period after the collision before beginning to break apart. As sections of the vessel separated and drifted away, many passengers suddenly found themselves forced into the water. After the vessel finally gave way, survival depended less on luck than on endurance. Hundreds of people were thrown into Lake Michigan amid rough conditions and darkness. Some managed to cling to floating debris. Others grasped fragments of the wreck itself. Portions of the ship continued drifting through the water, carrying survivors who desperately held on while waves repeatedly swept across them. For many, the struggle lasted for hours. The collision had been sudden, but the disaster that followed unfolded over an extended period as survivors fought exhaustion, exposure, and the relentless movement of the lake. The environment magnified every difficulty. Strong winds drove waves against wreckage and survivors alike. Darkness complicated rescue efforts and made it nearly impossible to determine how many people remained alive. Individuals separated from family members, friends, and fellow passengers found themselves isolated amid debris fields scattered across the water. The same forces that had contributed to the collision now worked against survival. Historical accounts from major Great Lakes disasters often emphasized the role of weather not merely as a background condition, but as an active participant in events. The sinking of the Lady Elgin provided another tragic example. As daylight spread across the water, the scale of the catastrophe gradually emerged. Survivors who had endured the night began reaching shore on pieces of wreckage or through rescue efforts mounted by local residents and passing vessels. Bodies were discovered along the shoreline. Debris from the ship washed ashore over a wide area. What had been hidden by darkness slowly became visible, revealing one of the most devastating maritime disasters in Great Lakes history. Contemporary reports varied in their casualty estimates, as was common during 19th century disasters, but historians generally agree that approximately 300 people lost their lives. Newspapers throughout the region soon carried reports of one of the worst maritime disasters in Great Lakes history. Public attention focused not only on the extraordinary loss of life, but also on the circumstances that had allowed the tragedy to unfold. The sinking became a subject of investigations, public discussion, and lasting historical interest. Communities throughout the Great Lakes region followed developments closely as details emerged regarding the collision, the rescue efforts, and the victims. The scale of the disaster ensured that it would remain in public memory long after the immediate shock faded. Long after the wreckage had vanished from the surface, the story continued to shape how people viewed travel on the inland seas. The Lady Elgin reinforced lessons that had already appeared throughout the history of Great Lakes navigation. Technology could reduce risk but could not eliminate it. Experience remained valuable but was not always sufficient. Weather and circumstance could combine in ways that overwhelmed even well-established vessels. Most importantly, the disaster demonstrated how quickly an accident could evolve into a mass casualty event once people were forced into the water and left to confront the full power of the lake itself. Today, the story of the Lady Elgin remains one of the defining tragedies of 19th century Great Lakes history. Its legacy extends beyond casualty figures and historical records. The disaster serves as a reminder that many of the lake's deadliest events were not solely the result of a single collision, storm, or navigational error. Rather, they emerged when multiple factors converged at exactly the wrong moment, creating circumstances from which escape became extraordinarily difficult. Then came a storm so widespread and destructive that it no longer threatened a single ship or a single route, but nearly everyone unfortunate enough to be on the lake at the same time. Black Friday, the day the lake turned against everyone. On the morning of October 20th, 1916, nothing visible suggested that the lake was about to deliver one of the most destructive days in its history. Autumn had already settled across the Great Lakes, bringing cooler temperatures and increasingly unstable weather patterns, but such conditions were hardly unusual. Commercial traffic continued moving across Lake Erie as it always had. Captains reviewed routes, crews carried out routine duties, and vessels departed ports according to schedules shaped by the demands of commerce. To those watching from shore, it was simply another day on one of North America's busiest waterways. Yet beyond the horizon, forces were already gathering that would soon affect nearly every vessel unfortunate enough to be exposed to them. Far above the water, however, conditions were already assembling into something far more dangerous than an ordinary autumn storm. Meteorological records indicate that a powerful low-pressure system moved across the Great Lakes region, creating an environment capable of generating extreme winds and rapidly deteriorating conditions. Such systems were not uncommon during the autumn months, when warm and cold air masses frequently collided across the continent. What made this event different was the intensity with which those forces combined. Long before the first reports of disaster reached shore, the atmosphere itself was already creating the circumstances for one of Lake Erie's most infamous days. Throughout the western and central portions of Lake Erie, commercial vessels continued their voyages much as they had countless times before. By the early 20th century, the lake had become a critical transportation corridor, linking industrial centres, agricultural regions and shipping networks throughout the Great Lakes. Steamers carried coal, iron ore, grain, and manufactured goods. Freighters moved between ports that depended upon reliable transportation to sustain economic growth. Captains operating on the lake understood that autumn weather demanded caution, but they also understood that shipping schedules rarely paused simply because conditions might become difficult. For many crews, rough weather was considered part of the profession. The first signs of trouble likely appeared familiar. Winds strengthened, waves grew larger, visibility began to decline. None of these developments alone would necessarily have seemed extraordinary. Experienced mariners had encountered countless storms throughout their careers, yet Lake Erie possesses a unique ability to transform worsening weather into something more dangerous than many expect. As explored earlier, the lake's shallow depth allows wind energy to build steep, closely spaced waves with remarkable speed. Conditions that might remain manageable elsewhere can become exceptionally hazardous here. On October 20th, that process unfolded on a scale that few could have anticipated. By midday, the character of the lake had begun to change. Reports from the period describe powerful winds sweeping across broad sections of the water. Waves rose rapidly, creating conditions that challenged even large commercial vessels. Navigation became increasingly difficult as visibility deteriorated and the lake's surface grew more violent. Crews found themselves confronting not simply a storm but an environment changing faster than many could effectively respond to. The same forces discussed in previous chapters, the compressed wave patterns, the sudden weather shifts and the lake's unusual responsiveness to atmospheric change, were now combining into a single event affecting enormous areas simultaneously. What made the situation unusually deadly was that trouble was not confined to a single location. In many maritime disasters, the narrative centres on one vessel, encountering misfortune while others remain unaffected. Black Friday was different. Ships operating dozens or even hundreds of miles apart found themselves fighting the same storm. Captains made independent decisions, crews faced separate emergencies, and vessels encountered unique circumstances, yet all were trapped within the reach of the same meteorological system. The scale of the event transformed it from an isolated disaster into something far broader. Lake Erie was no longer threatening one ship, it was threatening nearly everyone on it. As reports later arrived from across the region, observers realized that multiple disasters had unfolded almost simultaneously. Among the vessels lost during the storm was the James B. Colgate, a large steel freighter carrying coal. Built to withstand the demanding conditions of Great Lakes commerce, The vessel represented the confidence of an era increasingly dependent upon industrial shipping. Yet confidence offered little protection against the conditions that developed that day. Sometime during the storm, the James B. Colgate disappeared with all hands. The vessel was eventually located decades later on the lake bed, providing physical evidence of the storm's destructive power. Among the vessels caught in the storm were ships whose crews would never have the opportunity to explain what happened aboard. Another victim was the DL Filer, a wooden bulk freighter that also vanished during the storm. Like many losses on the Great Lakes, the precise details of its final moments remain uncertain because few survivors remain to provide first-hand accounts. The absence of witnesses contributed to the enduring mystery surrounding many Black Friday losses. Investigators could reconstruct weather conditions, examine wreckage, and analyze maritime records, but certain details disappeared with the ships themselves. In this respect, the storm left behind not only wrecks, but unanswered questions. Other vessels suffered severe damage yet managed to survive. Crews battled enormous waves, mechanical failures, and navigational challenges throughout the storm. Some ships sought shelter where possible. Others attempted to maintain control in increasingly dangerous conditions. Every captain faced difficult decisions with limited information. Weather forecasts in 1916 were far less sophisticated than those available today, and communication systems provided only partial awareness of conditions elsewhere on the lake. Many crews had little understanding of how widespread the disaster had become until long after the storm had passed. Under such conditions, even the possibility of rescue became uncertain. The same winds and waves threatening vessels also limited efforts to assist them. Ships struggling for their own survival could do little to help others. Visibility remained poor. Communications were unreliable. In some cases, disaster unfolded so quickly that opportunities for outside assistance scarcely existed. The lake's vastness further complicated matters. Even if a distressed vessel managed to send a warning, reaching it through the storm could prove impossible. The result was a series of largely isolated struggles, occurring simultaneously across a hostile environment. When the storm finally loosened its grip, investigators faced the difficult task of understanding the scale of the destruction. Reports arrived gradually as surviving vessels reached port and missing ships failed to appear. Families waited for news. Shipping companies attempted to determine the fate of crews and cargoes. Newspapers compiled information from multiple sources, slowly revealing the extent of the disaster. The casualty figures associated with Black Friday vary among historical accounts, but there is broad agreement that dozens of sailors lost their lives and multiple vessels were destroyed. For many communities connected to Great Lakes shipping, the losses felt both personal and widespread. The significance of Black Friday extended far beyond the individual ships that were lost. Earlier disasters had demonstrated the vulnerability of single vessels. This storm demonstrated the vulnerability of an entire transportation network. It revealed that Lake Erie's dangers were not limited to isolated accidents, collisions, or navigational mistakes. Under the right conditions, the lake itself could become the disaster. Every lesson explored throughout the earlier chapters converged on October 20th, 1916. The shallow water, the steep waves, the rapidly changing weather, the accumulated history of shipwrecks, all of it became visible within a matter of hours. For maritime historians, Black Friday remains one of the clearest examples of why Lake Erie earned its reputation as one of the most dangerous bodies of fresh water in the world. The event was not remarkable because it destroyed a single famous ship. It was remarkable because it affected multiple vessels simultaneously, proving that no amount of experience, preparation, or distance from other disasters guaranteed safety. Captains operating on different sections of the lake encountered the same reality. When conditions reached a certain threshold, Lake Erie could overwhelm nearly everything placed upon it. Yet some of the deadliest chapters in Lake Erie's history would not be written by storms alone, but by decisions made long before the weather ever arrived. A disaster built by human hands. Not every vessel that vanished on Lake Erie was defeated by a storm, a collision, or the lake itself. By the time the events described in previous chapters had unfolded, the lake had already earned a reputation for sudden weather, violent waves, and catastrophic shipwrecks. Yet some of the deadliest tragedies associated with the Great Lakes emerged from dangers that existed long before a vessel encountered rough water. They originated in design choices, operational practices, neglected warnings, and decisions made by people who never intended to create a disaster. Unlike storms, these dangers could remain invisible until the moment they revealed themselves, and when they did, the consequences could be just as devastating as anything nature could produce. Long before the disaster that would make its name infamous, the steamship Eerie was simply another link in a growing transportation network. Built during an era when steam navigation was transforming travel throughout the Great Lakes, the vessel operated as a passenger steamer connecting communities that depended increasingly upon waterborne transportation. Steamships represented progress, speed, and economic opportunity. They shortened journeys, improved communication between distant regions, and helped support the rapid expansion of commerce across the lakes. To passengers stepping aboard vessels like the Eerie, steam power often symbolized the future. Across the Great Lakes, the 1830s and early 1840s witnessed a dramatic expansion of passenger travel. New routes opened. Existing routes grew busier. Competition among operators intensified as companies sought to attract customers in an increasingly crowded marketplace. The pressure to maintain schedules and maximize revenue became an important part of the industry's culture. While many operators prioritized safety, regulations governing passenger vessels remained far less comprehensive than they would become later in the 19th century. Standards varied considerably, and some risks that would eventually be recognized as unacceptable remained common features of maritime transportation. Beneath the optimism surrounding this growth, however, certain vulnerabilities received far less attention than they deserved. Steamships relied upon boilers, furnaces, fuel storage, and complex mechanical systems that introduced hazards largely absent from traditional sailing vessels. Fire represented one of the greatest concerns. Many steamships of the era contained significant amounts of wood in their construction, while combustible materials could be found throughout passenger accommodations and cargo spaces. A fire at sea presented unique challenges. Unlike a building on land, a vessel offered limited escape routes, restricted access to firefighting resources, and little opportunity to separate occupants from the source of danger. These concerns were not entirely theoretical. Fires had occurred aboard vessels before, and maritime operators understood the threat they posed. Yet safety practices remained inconsistent, and the rapid growth of transportation often outpaced efforts to establish uniform standards. The relationship between profit and safety has appeared repeatedly throughout transportation history. Additional precautions frequently required additional costs, while competitive pressures encouraged efficiency and speed. Most voyages ended without incident, which made it easier for some risks to be overlooked or underestimated. The danger existed not because disaster was inevitable, but because warning signs often appeared less urgent until something went wrong. During August 1841, travellers boarding the Eerie had little reason to suspect that the voyage would end differently from countless others. The vessel departed Buffalo on August 9th, carrying passengers westward across Lake Erie. Historical accounts vary regarding the exact number of people aboard, but the ship was carrying a substantial complement of travellers. Families, merchants, labourers, and other passengers settled into the routines of a journey that many likely expected to complete without difficulty. The lake itself was not the primary threat that day. No extraordinary storm dominated the horizon. No famous collision awaited in the darkness. The danger was already aboard. Then a small flame appeared in a place where no one could afford to ignore it. Sometime during the voyage, a fire broke out near the vessel's engine area. Precisely how the fire began remains a subject of historical discussion, but contemporary investigations and later accounts pointed toward combustible materials and conditions that allowed flames to spread rapidly. What began as a localized emergency quickly evolved into something far more serious. Fire aboard a wooden steamship could move with alarming speed, particularly when aided by wind and the vessel's own forward motion. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Flames advanced through sections of the ship before many passengers fully understood the scale of the danger. Smoke spread throughout occupied areas. Crew members attempted to respond, but the circumstances proved extraordinarily difficult. Unlike a fire on land, there was no straightforward means of evacuation. Every option carried risk. Remaining aboard meant facing advancing flames. Leaving the vessel meant confronting open water. As the fire expanded, those choices became increasingly desperate. For many aboard, the most terrifying realization was not that the ship was burning, but that escape options were disappearing just as quickly. Historical accounts describe passengers attempting to reach areas of relative safety while the fire continued spreading. Some sought refuge away from the flames, others prepared to abandon the vessel. The lake itself became an unavoidable factor in survival. Even though weather conditions were not the primary cause of the disaster, the realities of open water still shaped events. Passengers forced into the lake faced dangers associated with distance from shore, limited rescue capabilities, and the physical challenges of remaining afloat. As the fire consumed larger portions of the vessel, panic inevitably increased. Some passengers jumped into the water. Others attempted to cling to debris or portions of the wreckage. Rescue efforts unfolded under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Historical sources indicate that nearby vessels and individuals participated in efforts to save survivors, but the speed of the disaster limited what could be accomplished. Many lives were lost before meaningful assistance could arrive. The tragedy became one of the deadliest transportation disasters in the United States up to that time. When news of the catastrophe reached shore, the scale of the loss shocked communities throughout the region. Contemporary reports varied in their casualty estimates, as often occurred during 19th century disasters, but historians generally agree that approximately 250 people died in the fire. The magnitude of the tragedy ensured widespread public attention. Newspapers covered the disaster extensively. Survivors shared accounts of the chaos they had witnessed. Questions quickly emerged regarding the factors that had allowed such a catastrophic fire to occur aboard a passenger vessel. The destruction of the Eerie ultimately raised questions that extended far beyond a single vessel. Investigations and public discussions focused on issues that would appear repeatedly throughout transportation history. Were adequate safety measures in place? Had known risks been addressed properly? Were existing standards sufficient to protect passengers? The disaster helped encourage broader conversations about maritime safety, vessel construction, emergency preparedness, and operational practices. While reforms often emerge gradually, major disasters frequently provide the momentum that drives change, and the Eerie proved no exception. Nor was the Eerie entirely unique. Throughout the history of Great Lakes navigation, investigators repeatedly encountered incidents in which human decisions amplified natural risks. Overloaded vessels, inadequate maintenance, poor communication, insufficient safety equipment, and operational shortcuts sometimes transformed manageable situations into catastrophes. Nature remained dangerous, but human choices often determined how effectively that danger could be confronted. The distinction matters because it reveals that not every tragedy was unavoidable. Viewed within the broader history of Lake Erie, the tragedy exposed a different category of danger altogether. Previous chapters explored storms that developed with little warning, waves capable of overwhelming ships, and weather systems powerful enough to affect entire fleets simultaneously. The loss of the Eerie demonstrated that danger could also originate from within. A vessel might survive the lake itself only to be destroyed by circumstances created through oversight, negligence, or inadequate preparation. In such cases, the water merely became the setting in which deeper problems revealed themselves. For historians studying Lake Erie's long record of disasters, this realization adds another layer to the lake's reputation. The enormous death toll associated with its waters cannot be explained solely through geography or weather. Human actions are part of the story as well. Every shipwreck represents a unique combination of circumstances, and some of those circumstances began long before a vessel encountered a storm, a shoal, or a dangerous wave. The lake may have delivered the final consequence, but the chain of events often started elsewhere. Even now, many of those stories remain preserved in darkness, resting where the lake chose to keep them. Beneath the surface lies a lost fleet. In the quiet moments when the winds over Lake Erie settle, and the water appears almost ordinary, it is difficult to imagine what lies beneath its shifting surface, where modern navigation routes cross above corridors of submerged history that have accumulated over centuries of shipping, fishing, and industrial movement. From above, it presents itself as one of the most heavily used and seemingly accessible of the Great Lakes. Yet beneath that accessibility lies a complex underwater landscape shaped by sudden weather changes, navigational miscalculations, and storms that have redefined the limits of inland maritime travel. What appears as open water is, in reality, layered with traces of passage after passage, many of which ended without return. As systematic underwater surveying expanded across the Great Lakes region, Lake Erie gradually revealed itself not just as a transportation route, but as a resting place for an unexpectedly large number of wrecks preserved in varying states of completeness. Maritime historians and marine archaeologists working in the basin have documented vessels from different eras of commercial shipping, including wooden schooners from the 19th century and later steel-hulled freighters that reflect the industrial expansion of the Great Lakes trade network. In many cases, the cold freshwater environment has slowed decomposition far more effectively than saltwater would have, allowing hull structures, machinery components, and even cargo configurations to remain recognizable long after sinking. This preservation has turned the lakebed into a kind of submerged archive, where history is not erased but quietly stored in darkness. The process of locating these wrecks has been transformed by advances in sonar imaging and remote sensing technologies, which allow researchers to identify irregular shapes on the lake floor that do not match natural sediment formations. Side-scan sonar in particular has played a crucial role in mapping large sections of the basin, revealing outlines of vessels that had been lost to memory long before their rediscovery. Some of these wrecks are well documented in maritime records, matching historical accounts of known sinkings, while others remain without clear identification, their origins obscured by incomplete documentation, missing logs, or the absence of survivors who could confirm final details. Each new discovery adds another layer to an already complex record, but also expands the number of sites that remain partially or entirely unexplained. Among the most striking aspects of these findings is the condition in which many wrecks are found, often resting upright or partially intact, as if they had settled gently rather than been violently destroyed. This has led researchers to consider the nature of sudden weather systems on the lake, where conditions can deteriorate rapidly enough to overwhelm vessels before distress signals can be properly communicated. Historical accounts of maritime disasters on the Great Lakes often describe storms that intensified with little warning, producing wave heights and wind conditions capable of overpowering ships that were considered structurally sound for inland navigation. One of the most referenced events in regional maritime history is the Great Lakes Storm of 1913, which affected multiple lakes in the system and resulted in significant loss of life and vessels, leaving behind wrecks that would later become part of ongoing archaeological study. Despite this historical record, what continues to draw attention is not only the known wrecks but the large number of unidentified sites detected across different mapping projects. These are vessels that appear in sonar scans but cannot be matched with existing registries, suggesting gaps in historical documentation or losses that were never formally recorded. In some cases, shipping records from the 19th and early 20th centuries are incomplete or inconsistent, especially during periods of rapid industrial expansion, when transportation networks were expanding faster than regulatory systems could fully track them. As a result, the lakebed contains a mixture of confirmed wrecks and uncertain structures, each contributing to a broader sense that the full extent of maritime activity and loss has never been fully accounted for. Divers who have explored selected wreck sites within Lake Erie often describe the experience as both technically demanding and psychologically disorienting, not because of dramatic visual effects, but because of the stillness that surrounds the remains. Unlike oceanic wrecks that are often encrusted with dense marine growth, many Great Lakes wrecks retain a more immediate resemblance to their original structure, allowing observers to recognize details such as deck layouts, cargo holds, and mechanical components with unusual clarity. This preservation creates an unsettling sense of proximity to the moment of sinking, as though the passage of time has slowed rather than erased the final conditions of the vessel's descent. In deeper waters, visibility can shift quickly with minor disturbances, causing even well-defined structures to fade into obscurity within seconds. What complicates interpretation further is the uneven distribution of wrecks across the lakebed, where certain zones appear densely populated with remains, while others remain relatively empty despite similar navigational conditions. Researchers have suggested that this may reflect historical shipping routes, storm patterns, and underwater topography that influenced how vessels moved and reacted during emergencies. Narrow channels, shifting currents, and sudden depth changes may have contributed to repeated loss in specific corridors, effectively turning portions of the lake into recurring zones of maritime risk. Yet even with these explanations, the pattern remains only partially understood, as not every wreck aligns neatly with expected routes or documented voyages. Over time, the accumulation of these discoveries has reshaped how Lake Erie is understood in maritime history, shifting its image from a simple inland waterway to a deeply layered historical environment where human activity and natural force have intersected continuously for generations. Each wreck represents not only a single incident, but also a fragment of broader economic, industrial, and environmental systems that once depended on the lake for transportation and trade. And while modern technology has made it possible to locate and study these remnants with increasing precision, it has also made it clear that the full extent of what lies beneath the surface has not yet been fully revealed, as each survey seems to uncover new structures that were previously unknown or unrecorded. Even today, as mapping continues and more sections of the lakebed come into view, researchers acknowledge that the catalogue of known wrecks may still represent only a portion of what actually rests below, waiting in layers of sediment and silence, shaped by time and water that remembers more than it reveals. As the water begins to harden into a colder, more unyielding state across the northern reach of the lake, its hidden depths prepare to become even less accessible than before. When ice becomes another enemy. With the gradual withdrawal of seasonal warmth from Lake Erie's surface, the transformation that follows does not arrive as a sudden shift, but develops in layers that extend outward from the shoreline, where the first signs of structural change begin to appear in ways that are not immediately distinguishable from ordinary winter movement. The same body of water that previously revealed its hidden history through submerged wrecks beneath its depths now begins to alter its expression at the surface, where motion slows, sound carries differently, and open water narrows into fragmented fields that do not yet behave like a unified frozen system. In this transitional state, the lake is neither fully liquid nor fully solid, but something in between that still responds to wind, pressure, and temperature in ways that are not always visible to the human eye. Early formations of ice across Lake Erie often present a deceptive continuity, where broad, uninterrupted surfaces give the impression of stability, despite underlying variations in thickness that continue to develop unevenly beneath wind-driven pressure. This uneven formation is strongly influenced by the lake's shallow depth, which allows it to freeze more quickly than deeper bodies of water in the Great Lakes system, yet also makes it more responsive to atmospheric shifts that can disrupt newly formed ice with minimal external force. What appears smooth from a distance can conceal ridges, weak points, and shifting plates of ice that remain in constant subtle motion, even when the surface appears still. In many coastal areas, ice formation begins and breaks repeatedly before reaching a stable seasonal state, creating a landscape that looks solid only in brief intervals rather than as a continuous condition. Within historical navigation and winter rescue documentation from the Great Lakes region, recurring accounts describe ice conditions that altered without visible warning, interrupting established travel routes and complicating efforts to reach those already in distress. These records often reflect situations in which individuals or groups moved across surfaces believed to be stable, only for conditions to deteriorate rapidly due to temperature changes or internal stress within the ice sheet itself. The unpredictability described in these accounts does not rely on dramatic storms or extreme weather alone, but instead emerges from the lake's own structural response to gradual environmental change, where instability can develop without obvious external triggers. In several documented rescue operations across the broader Great Lakes system, responders have had to navigate unstable ice fields where progress was slowed not by weather alone, but by the constant need to test every section before advancing. Even with modern forecasting systems and expanded winter safety advisories, activity on frozen sections of Lake Erie continues during periods when surface conditions appear stable enough to support movement across long distances. Ice fishing communities, shoreline travellers, and recreational users often rely on visual assessment and local knowledge to judge whether conditions are safe, even though thickness can vary significantly across short distances due to wind exposure and shifting currents. The gap between appearance and actual load-bearing capacity becomes especially significant when snow cover hides cracks or pressure ridges, preventing clear visual identification of weakened zones. This creates situations where risk is not immediately recognisable until failure begins to occur beneath the surface of assumed stability. Beneath the surface appearance of stillness, Lake Erie's shallow depth and exposure to sustained wind influence contribute to internal ice motion, that can generate stress fractures across wide sections without any immediate external disturbance. Wind acting across the open expanse of the lake can push large sheets of forming ice against one another, creating pressure ridges that rise and collapse in cycles depending on temperature and force distribution. These internal dynamics are not always visible from shore, yet they continuously reshape the ice field throughout the winter season, producing conditions where stability is temporary rather than fixed. Even in areas that appear solid for extended periods, subsurface movement can continue to weaken structural integrity without obvious surface indicators. Even when regional weather conditions remain relatively calm, subtle temperature variations combined with shifting pressure within the ice sheet can continue to alter structural integrity in ways that are not immediately visible from above. A slight warming trend during the day followed by rapid cooling at night can cause expansion and contraction cycles that weaken bonds between ice layers, creating internal separation that is difficult to detect without direct measurement. Over time, these repeated cycles contribute to a fragmented structural system in which strength is unevenly distributed across the frozen surface. This unevenness becomes especially dangerous when combined with snow cover or wind-driven drift patterns that obscure visual cues. Over extended winter cycles, the frozen state of Lake Erie demonstrates a recurring pattern in which apparent stability persists only briefly, before giving way to structural changes driven by forces that operate beneath perception. Each seasonal freeze does not produce a uniform condition, but rather a constantly evolving surface that shifts between stability and fragility depending on environmental interaction. Despite advances in monitoring and forecasting, the lake continues to produce conditions where surface appearance cannot reliably predict structural behavior, reinforcing a long-standing characteristic of unpredictability during its frozen state. Shifting winter conditions ultimately reveal a continuous pattern in which each transformation across Lake Erie alters how risk is expressed, while the underlying hazards remain embedded within every new surface state that forms over time. While Lake Erie still claims lives today, following the return of open water across Lake Erie after the seasonal break in ice coverage, the lake's surface resumes its constant movement, restoring the conditions that allow navigation, recreation, and commercial passage to re-establish their presence across familiar routes. What appears at first to be a simple reversal of winter transformation is, in practice, a transition back into a highly active system, where human activity and environmental variability overlap continuously across the same space. The shoreline once again becomes a point of departure rather than limitation, and the lake returns to a state where visibility increases, but predictability does not necessarily follow. Contemporary use of Lake Erie reflects a sustained level of maritime and recreational engagement, where fishing activity, vessel traffic, and seasonal tourism converge within the same geographic space that has long supported both economic utility and environmental risk. As one of the most heavily utilized bodies of water in the Great Lakes system, it functions simultaneously as transportation corridor, recreational destination, and working waterway, creating conditions where different levels of experience and preparedness coexist in close proximity. This overlap means that the same sections of water can be used by large commercial vessels and small recreational boats within the same time frame, increasing the complexity of navigation even under ordinary conditions. Modern forecasting systems applied across the Great Lakes region rely on satellite data, atmospheric modelling, and continuous environmental monitoring to track weather developments that influence Lake Erie's rapidly changing surface conditions. These systems have significantly improved the ability to anticipate large-scale weather patterns, particularly storm systems that move across the region, and they provide critical updates that are widely used by mariners and coastal communities. However, the lake's localized conditions can still diverge from broader regional predictions, especially when sudden shifts in wind direction or temperature create rapid changes that develop at a smaller scale than standard forecasting resolution can fully capture. Even with these technological systems in place, reports of incidents on Lake Erie continue to emerge during periods when localized weather shifts develop faster than broader predictive models can fully register. These situations often involve rapidly changing wind conditions, sudden wave formation, or reduced visibility that affects navigation within a very short time window. In many cases, conditions that appeared manageable at departure can evolve into significantly more challenging environments before vessels have the opportunity to adjust course or return to shore. demonstrating that improved forecasting reduces uncertainty but does not eliminate it entirely. Among frequent users of Lake Erie's waters, behavioral patterns often reflect a gradual normalization of risk, where repeated exposure to familiar routes and conditions can influence perception of risk during changing environmental conditions. This familiarity effect can lead to increased confidence in interpreting visual cues such as wave height, wind behavior, or cloud formation, even when those cues are part of rapidly evolving systems. Over time, experience can become both an advantage and a limitation, offering practical knowledge while also encouraging reliance on assumptions that may not hold under shifting atmospheric conditions. Across decades of documented maritime history on Lake Erie, patterns observed in both historical and contemporary records indicate a persistent alignment between environmental volatility and moments of sudden navigational failure. While the tools used to navigate the lake have changed dramatically over time, from early compass-based navigation to modern GPS and digital tracking systems, the underlying environmental behavior has remained consistent in its ability to produce rapid and localized changes in conditions. This continuity suggests that technological advancement has improved detection and response capabilities, but has not fundamentally altered the nature of the lake's most unpredictable moments. The interaction between improved forecasting capabilities, sustained human activity, and Lake Erie's long-established environmental behavior forms a continuing system in which increased knowledge does not consistently eliminate exposure to risk. Navigation today occurs with more information than at any previous point in history, yet that information still operates within an environment that can shift faster than it can be fully interpreted or acted upon. In this space, decision-making becomes a balance among data, experience, and rapidly changing physical reality, where none of these elements can fully override the others when conditions change abruptly. Lake Erie remains the same body of water that has taken vessels beneath its surface, reshaped itself through ice, and continued claiming lives across generations without ever revealing a final reason for its enduring unpredictability.